Hello, very beautiful community. A quick take on the fact that Trump, despite the prospect of further escalation from Israel, has forced a deal and changed not his mind, because he has very few beliefs about which to change his mind. That's the typical psychology of a narcissist. But Trump has changed his line on what he would allow Israel to do. It's a fascinating question how that happened, and we'll say a word about that in a moment. But to think about this in general is hard, because you've got to keep in mind several things. You've got to keep in mind the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and all of the calamities and injustices of that process for decades. You've got to keep in mind democratic decline in Israel, because when October 7th happened, Israel was experiencing a wave of protest against the authoritarian turns of the Netanyahu government. Protests that cultivated their solidarity not by being clear, but actually by evading the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Then you've got to keep in mind October 7th, and then you've got to keep in mind what Israel did in Gaza since. And we'll talk about the application of language to that, maybe on the philosophy channel, when I plan to do a talk about the concept of genocide, which is too loosely used in our culture. And of course, we'll also talk about the moral categories, the moral implications of what happened in Gaza in a long talk I'll do on the chat channel. But we're certainly talking about an exercise that's strategically needless in mass slaughter, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing. Israel cannot be secure if its security in the medium and long term keeps being attained, right, at the cost of the blood and bones of Palestinian children. I'm not saying that that's wrong. That's a separate conversation, an important conversation. I'm saying it's not effective. Putin's project down the line will also fail for similar reasons. It's not sustainable to maintain your security in that mode. It's not going to last. But of course, what we're looking at is a victory and a surrender for Hamas for now. This is going to have deleterious consequences for international relations, the shape of this, because, of course, it's a clear example where might is right. We could do this, we did this, and now we're the victors. As I say, that's not going to be sustainable for Israel, but it is the model that's set now for the Russians and for the Chinese, that successful solutions to political challenges via the use of mass violence by major powers can work. And the faint voices of the UN or the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice don't matter. Enough. Now, Netanyahu didn't want this and still doesn't want the next steps of this deal, but he was forced into it by Trump, who had considerable leverage, is very popular in Israel. But getting Hamas to agree was harder, and this was about pressure from Qatar, Egypt, Turkey, along the lines of this is it. This is now enough, and the leverage of keeping the remaining Israeli hostages is gone. These people are now returned rightfully to where they should have been all the time, and the many Palestinian detainees are being released too. Question arises about the next steps. We've got to be clear about Trump's problem with systematicity and discipline to continue being involved and to continue pressuring the Israelis. And we've got to realize that we're not in a historical moment where a two-state solution is remotely realistic. In a way, this is a condemnation of US imperialism in the region insofar as US attempts to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict actually ended up, cumulatively speaking, being a sort of cover for history moving further rather than closer to a solution, right? As the United States was talking about a two-state solution, Israeli settlements in the West Bank were expanding and so on. So there was a real history of US failure there, and obviously of US neutrality too, favoring Israel too strongly, and in the way they tried to resolve the conflict. But it's not, doesn't follow from that US efforts have been refuted. It doesn't follow from that it was impossible for the United States to solve the conflict. Now, let's come back for a moment to how this may have happened for Trump and whether the Nobel Peace Prize played a role. And my suggestion here is yes, right? So you imagine a hypothetical scenario where the Qataris tell Kushner, we'll pressure Hamas if you get Trump to pressure Israel. Kushner tells Trump, pressure Israel, because then you can get the dangly, shiny toy we've got in front of you, which is the Nobel Peace Prize, and you might even get it this year. If not, you can aim for it next year. And Rory Stewart, interestingly, raised the question of what would be more constructive for Trump, to get the prize this year. Would that motivate him to be more effectively engaged? Or would it be better to not get it and then actually be motivated by the prospect of getting it next year? So the prospects of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the fate of the Palestinian people, including what happens next. There's going to be no two-state solution, but how close can we realistically move to a situation where folks in Gaza can begin some kind of reconstitution with a degree of self-government, a degree of prospects for livelihood and not being obliterated by bombardment all the time. About all of that, I'd be pessimistic. But we've got a positive turn right now, and it's important to acknowledge that. And that too can be, I think, part of your confusion, right? Because you say, well, Vlad, you're telling me I've got to consider the domestic politics in Israel, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, what's happened in the last 2 years plus. And now you're telling me I've got to consider different things about Trump's motivation, which is tricky because it's probably true that Trump can't do much good for good reasons, but Trump can do some good for ill-assorted reasons. Trump is capable of acting constructively to a degree. And in this case, we're talking about constructive action for purposes of narcissistic supply, because the narcissistic supply of indulging Bibi got massively outweighed by the narcissistic supply of trying to bring things to a stop and maybe get the Nobel Peace Prize. Trump also, speaking in the Knesset, mentioned Russia, that is still keen to resolve that conflict. And the question is his ideological affinity going to go anywhere with Putin? The answer is no. Is his narcissistic supply dependence on Putin going to go anywhere? And the answer here is that it could either break down, which is a violent, psychologically and very unlikely scenario, or is it going to be temporarily outweighed by other considerations? And I think that's where we're moving. But Trump will always remain, unless a breakage occurs in his narcissistic supply dependence on Putin, Trump will always remain minded to think, well, wouldn't it be wonderful if Vladimir settled this, because then Vladimir and I can go around prancing together in a fantasy society into which he and I are both admitted. So that's my 2 cents. Talk to you very soon.